An interesting topic that we will address here today is narcissism and therapy or self-exploration. In other words, what is a narcissistic person's perspective in terms of themselves and therapy or self-work or self-examination? And I will talk about a few points that I have noticed and I found interesting and important. But first, a preface. In this video, I'm not going to define the term narcissist or narcissism. I've talked about it before, and I'm not going to use this word here in a precise clinical way. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please go read my articles on it and educate yourself about the topic. I will just assume that you know what I'm talking about. Number one, if you have had relationships with narcissistic people, if you have encountered somebody who has strong narcissistic tendencies, you probably have noticed that most narcissistic people don't go to therapy. They don't like self-examination. They lack self-awareness. And usually they tend to simply avoid that. And mainly it is so because they have problems accepting their flaws. And therapy requires, or even considering therapy, considering looking at yourself critically, requires self-reflection. You have to see who you are and accept that as a fact in order to see that you have some flaws and you can work on them. For somebody who has strong narcissistic tendencies, it is very painful to accept that you have flaws. Therefore, they lack self-reflection and they don't seek help, or they don't seek working on themselves. They don't want to get better. Moreover, oftentimes they get rewarded for being narcissistic, for being fake, for being abusive. All of that gives them narcissistic supply. It gives them power. It might give them status. It might give them drama, because narcissistic people like fighting and drama and gossiping and all this stuff. So narcissistic behavior gives them all of that, attention mainly. So they also may lack a long-term perspective. So for somebody who is not on a spectrum of narcissism very far to the direction where they are far too gone, for somebody like that, they can understand that it is beneficial to work on yourself and to improve yourself and get better, and you would be happier because of that. For a narcissistic person, they lack a long-term perspective. They might be very compulsive or disconnected from themselves by definition. So they just don't have that perspective, or they just ignore that perspective. They are very opportunistic, so they look for opportunities how to increase their status, how to gain narcissistic supply, so they don't care too much about a long-term perspective. And all of that, all these things that I just talked about, makes them not even consider therapy because they don't see any benefits in it. Number two, why people with strong narcissistic tendencies don't seek therapy or don't value self-work is because they feel that they are experts in everything that they do. So they feel that they don't need it. They are just good as they are. And if they go to therapy, if they start working on themselves, it's very superficial, it's very short term. They might start it and then feel that, oh, I'm already an expert, I don't need it, I know everything that I need to know. So if they go to therapy, they very quickly might assume that they have learned everything that there is to know about the subject, that they are already experts in therapy, or maybe even that they are a therapist themselves. They can help everybody else. So if they go to therapy, if they explore themselves. Usually it's very short term and quite superficial, even though in their eyes they're doing a really good job and they're improving significantly and they're better than everybody else. They're basically experts in it. The next point is that narcissists usually, if they decide to go to therapy, do so because they want validation, and not real validation, but false validation, and it's validation for their perceived greatness. So they go to therapy, they go to an expert, and they expect for the expert to be amazed by how great the narcissistic person is. They want for them to recognize how great they are and how advanced they are and how smart they are. They're not so much interested in working on themselves, again, because it's very difficult for them to see that they have many flaws. It's more so because they want an expert opinion to validate that they are really wonderful. And if this doesn't happen, usually a narcissistic person feels very hurt. They might feel betrayed, but mainly they feel hurt. They feel that the therapist hurt them and that maybe the therapist is not competent. And usually narcissistic people enter therapy by idealizing the therapist or an expert. And what ends up happening is that very quickly, if the therapist doesn't recognize their greatness, they go from idealizing the expert to vilifying them, and it's very black and white. That's another trait of a narcissistic person, that they see the world in black and white terms. So first they idealize the expert, and then soon after that they see them as incompetent, as bad, as harmful, and they just usually quit therapy. And I will expand on that in the next point. Number 4, narcissistic people oftentimes don't do very well in an environment where they are not better than everybody else. So when they enter a therapeutic relationship, oftentimes they start feeling inferior. They can't tolerate an environment where they feel inferior. And in a therapeutic environment, a therapist, an expert, usually can see your flaws, can see your personality. And for someone who is highly narcissistic, this can be unacceptable because, again, they see themselves as flawless in many ways, or they're very sensitive to criticisms, to being challenged. So if a therapist doesn't give them narcissistic supply, or perhaps challenges them on some points, or brings up some suggestions, they might not respond very well. And a defense mechanism of being exposed, because that's how they feel in therapy oftentimes, that they are exposed, that this other person sees them for who they are, and this is dangerous, and then perhaps they deal with that by trying to one-up the therapist, by trying to be better at therapy than the therapist. Again, it's all about comparison and feeling better about yourself, and putting other people down, and comparing yourself and presenting yourself as an expert and feeling as an expert. So in a narcissistic person's mind, they become a therapist, or they become an expert, or at least they're on the same level as a therapist. And they defend themselves from that unpleasant realization that maybe they are not that good as they think they are. They defend themselves from that by trying to challenge the therapist, by trying to shift the conversation about the therapist, by challenging the therapist, by talking about the therapist, by seeing the therapist not as a helper, not as somebody that can help you, but as an opponent. It becomes a fight. And usually, as I've said before in the previous point, in the beginning, the therapist is seen as an idealization. And after a while, the narcissistic person starts to feel paranoid, starts to feel vulnerable and exposed, and all of that leads to eventually discontinuing therapy because it's too painful. Number 5, some narcissistic people actually are interested in psychology and how a human mind works, and social psychology and all these good things. But the catch is, they are interested in all these things not so much because they want to improve themselves and get better and improve the world and help the world, but more so because they want to learn how to manipulate better. They want to learn psychological tricks, how to trick other people, how to get better at narcissism, how to get better at being abusive, how to get better at being manipulative, and get away with it better. Or they might learn some weird theory to justify their unhealthy behavior, to have a rationale for that. Or they might learn some words that psychologists use and throw them around to appear that they know what they're talking about, or to confuse other people, or to create a conflict. So they learn about psychology, about self-work, or they pretend that they know all these things to appear as an expert themselves. And this leads us to the next point. And the last point is that some narcissistic people actually seek professions, seek environments where they would have power over others. So some of them work in the helping field or in the teaching field, or they become a celebrity, or they become a CEO or somebody else, where they would have a lot of power, a lot of attention, a lot of social pull, where they would interact with other people and they could use them for personal gain to the degree where they abuse other people, and oftentimes they can get away with it. So they like being in a position where they have power, where they have respect, where people fear them, where people give them a lot of attention. And having power over vulnerable people gives them a lot of narcissistic supply, a lot of validation that they are powerful, that they are not weak, that they are better than others, and all these other things that a narcissistic person might seek.